Hello. So in this second video, I'm going to go through the configuration file in opsdroid so we can have a look at all the different options that you can specify. So we're going to start off in the terminal. So this is following on from the end of the last video where we've got opsdroid installed locally and we've got opsdroid desktop as well. So as I said in the last video, by default everything gets put into a directory called .opsdroid, which is in your home directory. So if we have a look at what's in here, we have got a configuration YAML file, so that this is where we specify all the different configuration options for opsdroid along with all the different modules that need to be installed. I'll get a little bit more into those different modules as we go through it. There's also a directory in there where the modules get installed into, and then a Python site packages directory, which is where all the dependencies of those modules live. So I'm just going to open up the configuration file so we can have a look, and I'm just going to run through each of the different sections. So the first section here is the logging section. So this is just some kind of standard stuff for setting up your logging for opsdroid. As I said in the previous video, the default functionality is to log at info level, log to a file which lives in that .opsdroid folder, and also to log out to the console. So this can be a little bit annoying if you are trying to use the shell connector, because you're going to get log messages and the opsdroid shell both going into the console and kind of overwriting each other. So if you do want to use the shell connector, you can just uncomment this logging section. I'm happy with info and where it's right in the log file, so we'll leave those. But I'll also uncomment the console block. So if you haven't written YAML before, this is just it's a configuration language, and it it nests different options using indents. So we've got the logging block here, and then because there's an indent, it's shown that this console option is part of logging. So we're just going to move up here, and we'll set that to false. So now when I run opsdroid, it means that it won't log out to the console. So if I exit this and save it, and then run opsdroid, you should see nothing is coming into the console, and now we've just got the shell. So I can say hi, and it's saying hello back to me. There's no log messages going to the console at all. So let's drop out of that. You can also see the output.log. So if I cat the output.log, these are the log messages that would have been going into the shell, but they're now going just into the file. So let's go back into the configuration file again. So the next section after logging is to do with the modules. So as I showed you before, there is a modules directory within that .opsdroid folder. That's the default location. You can override it and tell it to install them somewhere else, but we're just going to leave that default for now. There's also now this web section. So opsdroid has a web server that's part of opsdroid, and it's used in a few different places. There's some endpoints for getting statistics about opsdroid, and there's also some connectors, the modules that connect you to the chat services that require some kind of webhook, some kind of URL that they can send messages to. So the Facebook connector, for example, you tell Facebook where the URL of your bot is, and then whenever somebody messages it on Facebook Messenger, Facebook sends a request to that URL. So there has to be a web server running to be able to receive those messages. By default, the web server is running just on localhost, so you can only connect to it locally from the machine you're on. If you do want to open this up, if you want to if you want to use the Facebook connector or any of those kind of webhook style connectors, then you need to set this to 0.0.0.0 or use some kind of proxy to allow the connections to come in from outside. The port also is default to 8080, but as you can see below, there are SSL options. So opsdroid can use HTTPS and use SSL encrypted connections on its web server. And if you don't specify the port here, if we leave this commented and uncomment our SSL section and give it actual paths to the certificate and the private key, this port will change to 8443. So it's just the 8000 range of the actual kind of HTTP port 80 or the 443 port for HTTPS. But we're just going to run it on port 80, so I'm just going to comment this back out again. Or not. I'm running this in a VM on a Mac, so I'm not entirely sure how to type that character. So I'm going to be really lazy and just copy and paste it. There we go. So that's the web server section. So as I said, there are some kind of opsdroid endpoints, and also connectors can use this, but also your skills can use it as well. So by default, the kind of standard options you would imagine for a skill would be when you receive a message from a chat client, you interpret what that message means and then run a Python function to do something in response to that message. But you can also match against webhook endpoints. So instead of input coming from a user through a chat client, the input could come in from some service hitting a webhook. So you might have a monitoring service or some kind of other service that can alert you through a webhook. You can point the webhook at opsdroid. So when something happens in your monitoring system, it will call opsdroid's webhook, which will trigger a skill to run. And that skill may very well, do a little bit of interpretation of that message and then post it into the default Slack room or something like that. So the bot will then, be notifying you within your chat, and then you could have other skills within the skill module, which you can then interpret the bot about the error. So, it could give you a notification, and then you could be able to ask follow-up questions depending on what skills are in that package. So the next section here are parsers. So the parsers are different modules within opsdroid for looking at the message that's come from a user or from some kind of event and understanding what that message means. So the default parsers that are enabled in opsdroid are regular expressions. So you can just match the message that's come from the user against a regular expression. And if it matches, then it calls the skill that's associated with it. We'll kind of get onto the practicalities of this in a later video. There's also a crontab parser. So instead of matching against a message coming in from a user, you're matching against a time. So every minute the crontab parser is called, and all the skills which match that crontab are called. So you can set up kind of scheduled events. So if you want your bot to announce something at a certain time every day, or maybe look something up from a web service and then send that to a specific user at a specific time, you can do that with a crontab parser. Also, the webhook parser falls in under here, so that can be configured in here as well. And then there's also more complex matching services that you can use. So there's at the moment you can use API AI if you like. So API AI is a third-party service, and they provide an API for matching a message to an intent, right? So an intent is something that you define in their web interface, and an intent is kind of like a type of question or message that you want to respond to in a certain way. And you give it a load of different example inputs that match that. So you could have how are you, how's it going, what's up, all those kind of different sentences mean roughly the same thing. So you have your intent of how are you, and then you have all those different examples of different ways of saying that. And API AI does some clever stuff to match from those examples to your intent, and it's quite good at matching things it's not seen before, but it feels should be still matching to that intent. It's quite good for just kind of getting around spelling errors and the kind of things you normally get in chat from a user. In order to use a service, you have to have your intent set up in API AI, and you also have to have an API key. So by default, this one isn't enabled, but if you want to use it, you just need to sign up for API AI, create some intents, and then uncomment this section and put your API token in here. It also, API AI gives you a score between 0 and 1 on how confident it is on the matching that it's done. And you can set a minimum score threshold here. So if you say, if the confidence is less than 0.6, then don't actually count that as a match. So that can be quite useful if it's triggering too often. So that's all the kind of standard opsdroid config stuff. The next sections are all about the different modules that you can install for opsdroid. So there's 3 different types of modules. There's connectors. These are modules which connect to a chat service and kind of pass that they broker the messages going back and forth. So when somebody says something in chat, the connector receives that, converts it into something that opsdroid knows how to deal with. It goes off and parses it, and then if there's a response that's required, that'll go back to the connector, and the connector knows how to send that back into the chat service again. So by default, you have the shell connector, so that's the one we demonstrated in the command prompt, and also the WebSocket connector. So this provides a WebSocket endpoint that you can write your own applications to connect to and talk to opsdroid. That's how opsdroid desktop works. And there's also another project which is quite in early alpha called opsdroid audio for kind of doing Alexa or Google Home style voice recognition. But both of those projects connect through the WebSocket connector. This is also where you would add a Slack connector or a Twitter connector or a Facebook Messenger connector or that kind of thing for interacting with these other third-party services. Some of these things may have additional options. So you can see in YAML here, this is a list. So we've got our connectors, and then a dash represents an element within a list. So this is one element, and it has a property name of shell. We could add other options by just indenting to that same level and have like, my other option with some value. Okay, so this is just another piece of configuration that will get passed onto that connector. Some connectors have required values, so like Slack or Twitter or Facebook Messenger will have API keys or authentication tokens or something that has to be handed back and forth. If you want to see what is required, just have a look at the actual README on any of the connectors. So it's worth saying that every single module within opsdroid refers to a Git repository. This can be either a local Git repository on your machine, it can be stored on GitHub, but opsdroid assumes that if you don't tell it where the repository is, that it should have a look at github.com/opsdroid/ and then the type of module - module name. So to load the shell module, I'm not telling it where to go and find the shell module. I could change this to say path is some local path. So that's a path to the module itself, or I could specify repo is some GitHub repository / some project. Okay, .git. So this is telling it where it could go and find that. But because I haven't specified that, what it assumes is the repo option, where the repo is equivalent to github.com/opsdroid/ then connector type, module type, sorry. So this is connector dash, and then whatever name you set, so shell.git. So this is a repository that exists in the opsdroid project. It is the shell module, but it makes this assumption. So you don't have to say that. You can just load in the default shell connector. But if you want to write your own connector, then you can easily write the Python module yourself, put it on your own GitHub account and point the repo at it, or even just write it locally and use the path option. So it doesn't actually have to be a Git repository, it can just be a directory, which is a Python module. So we'll move on to the next section now. The next section is databases. So opsdroid it has a concept of memory. So some of the skills within opsdroid may want to store something in opsdroid's memory and then retrieve it again later. By default, opsdroid just stores this in the system memory, it just stores it in RAM. So when you write stuff into opsdroid's memory, it will disappear if you stop the opsdroid process or restart the machine or restart the service. So if you want those values to actually persist and be stored, you need to use a database module. This just fits in with the kind of standard memory configuration in opsdroid. So when you use the memory option, you use it exactly the same way whether you have a database configured or not. But if you do have one configured, opsdroid will just make sure it stores all of those values there and it can get them back out again later. So for example, you could have a MongoDB instance running on your machine, and you could configure the Mongo module so that whenever you put something into memory, it writes it into that Mongo database. Again, all of the kind of configuration options and instructions are in the readmes of all the project pages for each module on GitHub. So the last section, which is probably the most important section, is the skills section. So in order to add any functionality to opsdroid, it's done in the form of skills. Skills are modules which have a load of functions in them. Each of those functions is an individual thing that opsdroid can do. We'll get onto that in a later video on exactly what they look like and exactly how you create them, but it's how you add any basic functionality to opsdroid. So you can see in the default config here, there's 4 skills that have been put in automatically. There's a comment here just to show which repository it is getting these from. as I said before, it will just, as we haven't specified a repository, it will just assume opsdroid / skill dash whatever that name is that you've set below. So these 4 basic skills are the hello world skill. So this is how we've just been saying hello to opsdroid, and it's been saying hello back. There's the seen skill, which is being able to ask opsdroid when it has last seen somebody. So if there's more than one user talking to this bot, every time you talk to it, it stores your username and a timestamp of when you spoke. It doesn't actually respond to you. It just parses every single message you say and stores your username with a date. And then somebody else could say to opsdroid, oh, when did you last see Jacob? And opsdroid will look up the date time that it last saw the username Jacob and respond with that. So that's one example of some data that needs to be stored in opsdroid's memory, the usernames and the dates, and those will get persisted in databases if you've got your database configured. There's also just a couple of kind of random meme type skills just to demonstrate functionality. So there's the dance skill. If you say the word dance anywhere in a sentence, it just gives you a GIF of somebody dancing. And the same for loud noises. So if any user writes a message in all caps, then it makes some kind of joke about that user shouting. It's usually a reference to Anchorman. So that's a basic overview of the configuration file. There's a full configuration reference in the opsdroid documentation. So if you go to opsdroid.github.io, click onto the documentation, in the menu on the left-hand side, there will be an option called configuration reference, and it will show you all these different options, plus any more that aren't configured in this default file, and loads of information about how to use them.